Earlier this week, the U.S. Court of International Trade struck down almost all of Donald Trump's tariffs. An appeal has been launched, that initial decision reversed, but more legal action is on its way. A real pleasure to welcome onto the program a lawyer from George Mason University who was at the center of the case that was successfully argued in front of the International Trade Court and that has launched this latest round of litigation. Ilya, welcome to Hub Hits.
Thank you very much for having me.
Tell us a little bit about where you were and how you reacted to the news that the arguments that you put forward at the International Trade Court had launched the first big kind of salvo against Trump's tariffs with virtually all of the various impositions that he's put on countries, Canada, China, around the world, being declared illegal.
Well, I was actually picking up my son from school when I got the email from the Court of International Trade indicating a decision to come down. So I tried to get home as quickly as I could. And when I did, I saw that a decision and I saw that we had won on virtually all significant points, as was also the case with the lawsuit decided in the same opinion filed by the state of Oregon and 11 other states, also challenging the tariffs imposed by Trump on nearly every country in the world, and also more specifically on Canada, Mexico, and China under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act of 1977. And obviously, I was happy that the court rejected the administration's position that essentially the president has unlimited power to impose virtually any tariffs he wants on any country at any time for any reason.
So talk to us about what happened as the week goes on. We've had a stay, is that the correct term here, of a higher court. Now this will go forward, Ilya, is that right, to another round of litigation? Where will that happen? When? How do you see this unfolding?
So the administration has appealed the decision to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit, which is the appellate court that has jurisdiction over the Court of International Trade. Right now, there is what lawyers call an administrative stay, which in plain English is a temporary stay to consider whether a more permanent stay should be imposed until the end of the appellate phase of the litigation. We obviously are going to oppose the government's request for a permanent stay, and we think we have good arguments against it. Within the next couple weeks, we should know whether there will be a permanent stay or not. But either way, there will be this appellate process at the Court of Appeals. It is also possible that eventually the case will reach the U.S. Supreme Court. I obviously don't know for sure what will happen, but we are guardedly optimistic because judges appointed by presidents of both parties, including one appointed by Trump, ruled unanimously in the Court of International Trade that these tariffs are illegal, and that even if this statute had given the president the authority he claims, then that would just make the law unconstitutional, because under our Constitution, it is the Congress, not the president, that has the power to impose tariffs and other taxes, and it's simply not constitutional for Congress to give virtually unlimited authority to impose taxes to the president, or tariffs for that matter, which are a form of taxes.
Ilya, one of the features of the president's use of tariffs has been to, in a sense, declare an emergency vis-a-vis Canada. He declared, in a sense, fentanyl an emergency, even though very small quantities of fentanyl were coming from Canada into the United States. How give us a little more of a sense of the crux of the case that you successfully argued at the International Trade Court, and again, how that might evolve as you go forward with the appeals court in D.C. and then maybe potentially the Supreme Court, as you said.
So I have to admit that our case focused only on the so-called Liberation Day tariffs, which imposed tariffs on almost every nation in the world on the pretext that trade deficits qualify as an emergency. But their accompanying case filed by the 12 states also included the fentanyl tariffs imposed on Canada, which were also struck down, and I think quite rightly so. The statute requires both that the president declare a national emergency and that that emergency must be with respect to an extraordinary and unusual threat. It's very obvious these requirements are not met when it comes to the trade deficit related tariffs because there's nothing extraordinary unusual about trade deficits, and they're pretty obviously not a threat. Most economists will tell you that trade deficits are perfectly fine. The fact that, for instance, we buy more goods from Canada than you import from us, that's not in any way some kind of a
Yeah.
problem for the U.S. economy. It just means we value the goods more than we value the
Sure.
money. I have a similar trade deficit with my local supermarket. They never buy anything from me. I buy a lot from them, but that doesn't mean that it's an emergency or any kind of threat. And the same applies here. The situation with fentanyl is slightly more complicated in that there you could at least argue that
Hmm.
fentanyl consumption is a genuine social problem, though I think it's actually the problem is caused by our misguided war on drugs, which we should get rid of rather than start a trade war with Canada. But still, as I think you suggested, particularly with respect to Canada, the amount of fentanyl that crosses the Canadian border to us is utterly infinitesimal. There's no emergency, there's no extraordinary
Right.
unusual threat. Pretty much anytime you make a substance that a lot of people want to take illegal, you are going to get some cross-border smuggling. So by this standard, throughout the entire era that the United States had alcohol prohibition, we constantly had an emergency and an extraordinary and unusual
Right.
threat because, of course, during that time, it was alcohol that was being smuggled across the Canadian border
Yes.
rather than fentanyl or today. With respect to Mexico, there is somewhat more fentanyl smuggling, but the overwhelming majority of it is actually by U.S. citizens crossing back into the U.S.
Hmm.
So the idea that we're somehow going to use to leverage tariffs to get Mexico to do what? To prevent U.S. citizens from returning to the United States. The whole notion is ridiculous, and there's obviously not a
Hmm.
genuine emergency or extraordinary unusual situation there, though I do recognize that fentanyl consumption is a
Hmm.
genuine social problem, and some fentanyl does get smuggled in from abroad,
Hmm.
obviously.
Ilya, you're going up against, the president's lawyers, against the Justice Department. I'm sure they have a theory of the case. So could you do us the favor of kind of steel manning what they're going to
Sure.
argue in the Court of Appeals to, oppose what, again, you've put forward, and I think everyone has commented on, would be a fairly conventional reading of the U.S. Constitution, and yes, indeed, Congress having the lead here, not the executive. Well, how are they going to argue this, and where do you think they might have some credibility, either with this appeals court or potentially at the Supreme Court?
So obviously, I don't know for sure what they're going to argue in the appeals court or in the Supreme Court, but I do know what they argued in the lower court so far, and I expect their continued argument to be relatively similar. They say that what qualifies as an emergency and also an extraordinary and unusual threat is totally up to the president to determine, and courts have no say in interpreting it. Therefore, he can declare whatever he wants to be an emergency and whatever he wants to be an extraordinary, unusual threat. And the idea here is that there should be deference to the executive's
Right.
positions on questions of foreign policy and the like. And they also argued that this statute provides for tariffs, even though it actually doesn't mention tariffs at all, but it does allow for regulation of international transactions, and they claim that regulation includes the power to impose tariffs, even though usually regulation and taxation are considered as separate powers, and we have U.S. Supreme Court precedents going back some 200 years, which say that. Essentially, there's no way to get around the fact that their position is basically that the president has virtually unlimited power, and the rest of us should trust him to wield that power responsibly. And maybe they'll come up with something else, but at least that's been their position so far.
Yeah, I'm talking to Ilya Somin. He's a professor at George Mason University and played a key role in this successful case forward at the U.S. International Trade Court reversing Donald Trump's tariffs. It's now on appeal. So, Ilya, let's assume it's going to go to the Supreme Court, and that's ultimately where this will be decided. We've seen this court recently have a favored view towards a more kind of an expansionist sense of what the president's powers, in fact, are. How are you reading the Supreme Court and where they would come down on this issue, and maybe what arguments could potentially be the most pervasive and persuasive with this body, given the fact that they too have to look pretty closely at the Constitution. And for lay people like me and our viewers, on some of these points, your Constitution seems rather clear. It seems rather in support of the side of the case that you're arguing.
Yeah, so it's a great question. Obviously, as I said before, I don't know for sure if this will even get to the Supreme Court, and I also can't know for sure what the justices will do. But if we do get to the Supreme Court and the case is decided on the merits as opposed to some technical procedural issue, I think we can be guardedly optimistic because our case and the lower court decision decided just now is based in large part on doctrines that the most conservative justices, the conservative majority on the Supreme Court, have been supporting. One is the major questions doctrine, which is a principle which says that when the executive claims to have delegated from Congress the power to decide a question of vast economic or political significance, that at the very least, that delegation has to be clearly stated in the law. For the reasons I mentioned before, there is no such clear statement in this law. At the very least, it's ambiguous. Do we actually believe that it's pretty clear that the law doesn't give the president this vast power? But at the very least, things are arguable and unclear. And if that's so, then under the major questions doctrine, the courts have to decide the case in our favor and against the government. You might ask, is this a major question? And my answer is that if this is not a major question, then I do not know what is. The president has started the biggest trade war since the Great Depression. He has damaged our relations with our allies. The tax foundation estimates over the next decade, this would impose some $2 trillion of taxes in the form of tariffs on the American people. So this is bigger than any of the things that the Supreme Court has said are major questions before. Up to now, to my mind, the biggest thing that was declared a major question by the Supreme Court was President Biden's attempt to use unilateral executive power to forgive over $400 billion in student loan debt. I thought that was a major question and a power grab, and the Supreme Court was right to strike it down. But even that seems relatively small in comparison to Trump's Liberation Day tariffs and the other tariffs involved in this case. The second big principle that the conservative majority, I think, might find appealing that's behind our case is the non-delegation doctrine. As I mentioned before, the Constitution gives the power to impose tariffs to the president. I'm sorry, to Congress, not to the president. It's right there in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. And the Supreme Court has said that there are at least some limits to how much congressional power can be delegated to the president. What those limits are is pretty fuzzy, and the Supreme Court has been relatively lax in enforcing that rule. But if there are any limitations at all, if there's any constraints on delegation, then they got to apply in a case like this, where the president essentially claiming the power to be able to impose any tariffs he wants on any country he wants, anytime he wants, simply by claiming that there's an emergency and an extraordinary unusual threat, and those determinations themselves, at least according to the government, are wholly up to the president, and he can decide whatever he wants. As one of the judges put it in oral argument in one of the two cases that was decided, she said that under this approach, the president could impose tariffs for any crazy thing. She gave the example of a peanut butter shortage being declared a national emergency. I say that would actually be more of a real problem and
Yes.
more of a potential emergency than trade deficits are, which are not, which are not an emergency at all.
Yeah.
But the government's lawyer, had to admit essentially that the president could declare pretty much anything he
Wow.
wants an emergency and impose tariffs as a result, because that is in fact their position.
Okay, hands off my peanut butter. Ilya Somin with George Mason University, right at the heart of this case at the International Trade Court in the United States. Thank you so much for coming on Hub Hits today.
Thank you very much for having me on.
If you're enjoying the kind of unique access that Hub Hits is giving you to newsmakers like Ilya, who are, again, at the heart of some of the big stories impacting Canada-U.S. relations, our economy, and all the big issues and questions of the day, please subscribe to this channel. If you're listening to this on our podcast feed, we would love you to write a review about the podcast, share it with friends and family. Let's get the word out there. Thanks again for listening. Back to you soon with another Hub Hit.